from our studios in the Southern Food and Beverage Museum in New Orleans. Welcome to our Louisiana Eats podcast series, Quick Bites. I'm Poppy Tooker. One Book, One New Orleans is a campaign for literacy and community. Every year, a book is chosen with the idea that New Orleans residents can share the experience of reading the same book at the same time. Through partnerships with the Literary Alliance of New Orleans, Louisiana Books To Prisoners, and the Center for Educational Excellence in Alternative Settings, the chosen book is provided free of charge to prison inmates and used in adult education programs throughout the greater New Orleans area. At the same time, the New Orleans Public Library, WRBH Reading Radio, and the Pirates Alley Faulkner Society host community programming and access to the book for those with limited income and impaired vision. In this way, everyone from an exclusive book club member to a prison inmate will share the experience of enjoying a good read. The selection for 2018 is Liz Williams' book, New Orleans, A Food Biography. Liz Williams is a force of nature. She's the founder and director of the Southern Food and Beverage Museum in New Orleans and president of the National Food and Beverage Foundation. Liz served in the U.S. Army as a JAG officer and taught arts administration law as well as historic preservation law. When we spoke in 2014, I began by asking her how this project came about.
I, all through the time of putting together the museum and everything, was doing a lot of work on the food of New Orleans because that was a part of the museum. And I kept looking for that definitive statement of why we have a cuisine in New Orleans. And all I could find were those assertions that all these ethnic groups came together in the same place and there was great bounty, and because of that, it kind of wrapped itself together and became a cuisine. And I said, that could be said of so many places. There were many ethnic groups coming together. There was great bounty, but nothing ever became a cuisine. You might have a particular dish that was associated with a certain area, or even a few dishes. But we have a real cuisine, and I couldn't figure out why we had a cuisine, and those same conditions might have existed someplace else, and they didn't have one. So this book was my sort of tracking it all down with my own little theories of why we have a cuisine.
Sometimes I found your law background very evident in that it was clear that it was the result of what you had researched. It was your belief, but it didn't look like anybody could ever pin you to the wall on it. And that was just, to me, the lawyer shining through,
Well, I'm not a historian, and I really relied on other people's histories. And you're absolutely right. I just took the legal training and said, find all this stuff and find the evidence and then put it together.
Well, speaking about the evidence, one of the subtitles in the book that caught my attention immediately was The Mythology of Creole Food. Now, let's talk about the myth versus the reality from your point of view.
Okay. First of all, because there is a myth, it tells you how important it is to our culture, and it's so one with our culture. So because of that, I think the fact that there is mythology is important. But we have creation myths. We have myths that explain certain things that we do. And I think all of that, it means that we are trying to tell the truth with a capital T through mythology. And that truth is that we all eat this food, that this food makes us one. And I think that that is the ultimate truth of the mythology. Now, do I think that it's accurate? No.
Well, give me some examples of some of those myths. I was fascinated to read about Madame Langlois. Tell us about her.
Madame Langlois is the mythical housekeeper of Bienville, and she was supposed to be the person who would be able to teach others how to cook Creole cuisine, even before it was called Creole cuisine, to anyone who was new to the area.
I'm really kind of surprised that we don't have a statue by now to the great first cooking teacher of New Orleans, you know? So she somehow figures into the story of the Petticoat Rebellion, right?
That's right. The Petticoat Rebellion is the story of the housewives of New Orleans, including some of the casket girls, who were so distressed that they didn't know how to cook the food of this new world that they took their pots and pans and wooden spoons and banged them like drums up and down the street to Bienville's house and demanded that someone teach them how to cook. Of course, there's no evidence that she was there. The fact that people found the house of Bienville as though it was this house there instead of just a place that where he was encamped or whatever.
Yeah, and it didn't burn down in one of those fires. You got to love that.
That's right. And that it was the casket girls who weren't, who were certainly not at the same time as Bienville. So all of that, I think, it's fabulous.
And what do you posit on this?
Well, I think that the creation of the whole cuisine is actually related to the fact that we were a French colony and not an English colony. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that the French were interested in food and cuisine is something that you see in that myth. So that is the truth of it, that there was a desire to eat well.
All those Europeans, they really do know how to eat well.
That's right.
And goodness knows we got tons of them here, didn't we?
That's right. We did.
But aside from those Europeans, I agree with you about this so wholeheartedly that the contribution of the Native Americans has been so overlooked in the cuisine. As you outline how the cuisine formed here, you make a special note of a people who you termed the Amerindians. What were their contributions to Louisiana's food?
Well, I think that they were important in a number of ways. First of all, they already had identified all these wonderful foods to eat. And when Iberville and Bienville came and the early peoples came, they relied so heavily on the Indians, the Native Americans, to show them what was available and where they could find it and how they could access it and all of that sort of thing. I believe that if they hadn't had that relationship, that it would have been many, many years before many of the things that we eat now would have been discovered, because no one would have known that those oysters were there, or no one would have known that you can eat these frogs or whatever if they hadn't done that.
Or the sassafras.
Or the sassafras, absolutely.
I always find that a particularly interesting element of the discussion because, you will have the people who will swear on a stack of Bibles that it's all about okra and the Bantu word gumbo. Mm-hmm. And somehow it has been so overlooked and forgotten that it was the French calling the sassafras filet for thread, but the Choctaws called it combo. So is it gumbo or is it combo? Do you think we'll ever know?
I don't think we will. No.
I don't think so either. So I'm not quite sure how you feel about this next term. And I hate it when it is said all like one thing. Cajun Creole. Creole Cajun. That makes me crazy. Where did that come from?
Well, this is also part of my theory. I really think that during the time of the 1984 World's Fair, the food of Louisiana could be found at little stations all throughout the Louisiana Pavilion. You had food writers and travel writers who came to the city, and they were here for 2 days or 3 days or whatever, and they ate the whole state in this one place. And
and that happened to be in New Orleans, too.
That's right.
That furthered their confusion.
That's right. And they didn't really understand the difference between Cajun and Creole cuisine. They didn't have the benefit of eating Cajun food in Cajun country and Creole food here in New Orleans. They ate it all together, and they didn't understand the geography or whatever, and it wasn't laid out within the pavilion in any geographic way.
I remember it being like one long linear thing that's now part of Riverwalk that didn't really make any sense.
That's right. So they couldn't really figure it out just from eating there. And then they had to write articles about it, and they realized that they were confused, or they didn't even realize there was a difference. And so if you look at articles from Bon Appetit and Gourmet and all of those magazines that were out at the time, that's when you start to see Cajun Creole written together, which they ate in New Orleans. And so then people started to request it here in New Orleans. And of course, restaurants wanted to give the tourists what they wanted. So then you started to get the use of that phrase even in New Orleans.
Copeland's Cajun American Cafe.
That's right.
And people who would come here and say, I'm going to go to New Orleans and eat some of that spicy Cajun food. And that was really not what was going to happen until fairly recently, since we're getting some authentic, real Cajun cooking here with Cochon and places like that.
Right. And then there was also the confusion caused by poor Paul Prudhomme.
Well, I was going to bring him up because I have always actually blamed this on him. He brought his Cajun ingredients from Cajun country, stuff we never saw here before in the city, took it to the Palace of Creole Cooking, Commander's Palace. And there, in my belief, the confusion began, but you further identified it for me with the World's Fair.
I think it was a combination of those things. I think it was personified by Paul Prudhomme, and it just made more sense to everybody because here they had a person that they could identify that all of this was confused in or conflated or whatever. And yet at the same time, their own experience by coming here and writing these articles was at the World's Fair.
Well, I learned so much from your book, and I had always looked at one of New Orleans' great geographic advantages, being a port city, as being the place where all of the commodities and luxuries from the Caribbean and Europe and the whole rest of the world could just pour into this city. But I had never really given any thought about what the rest of America was sending to us downriver. So what was coming down the river from the rest of America that you feel figures into this conversation?
Well, certainly when we started to get wheat from the rest of the world, I think that was really, really important. We were getting cranberries. We were getting all of those wonderful other things that were part of America that we, wouldn't have gotten before. And then when we became a state and we started to have the Americans come in here, then, we had all of the kinds of practices, especially the English practices and styles of eating and all that sort of thing. I actually believe, even though we were very big on accepting everything here, like bourbon and all those wonderful things that came down the river, and
what's not to like about that?
Exactly. So all of that was real. But if I had to quantify influence, I would say our influence out was actually bigger than the influence of what we got from the rest of America, not necessarily from the rest of the world, but from the rest of America.
Yeah, of course, bananas. My goodness.
Exactly.
If it weren't for New Orleans, I don't think Americans would eat bananas for breakfast every day like they do.
Absolutely. And they wouldn't be drinking coffee either.
Really?
I mean, this was what they call the natural port. And so as they started to grow coffee in Martinique and in Central America and then later in South America, it all came up to America through New Orleans.
I also loved your chapter on restaurants. And I would like you to explain your views on the Age of Enlightenment, especially the French Enlightenment, where you connect that directly with the restaurant culture here.
Well, we learn about the Age of Enlightenment in school, but often we mush together the English Enlightenment and the French Enlightenment. We don't really make a big distinction between those two, but they were very, very different. The English Enlightenment, which we often call the Age of Reason, was all about being rational and scientific and that sort of thing. The French Enlightenment was also about rationality and order, but they began to order the arts. And when they ordered the arts, they looked at the senses and they said, this is something that has several parts. There's the creation of something to be sensed. So that's music, that's art, that's literature, that's food. And then there's the other art, which is the art of appreciating those things, so that you then know how to listen to music. You learn how to look at paintings. You learn how to appreciate what you eat. That is its own art. So all of that began to be systematically discussed, and it was something that caused the haute cuisine to develop in Paris. It was related to the cause of the restaurant opening, and those attitudes were brought here by the people who were coming here. Even if they weren't schooled in it, they absorbed it just by being part of the culture. And so those were the people who were here who were saying, we're in France. Now, that's a second distinction between the French and the English colonies. The English always saw England as the motherland and the colonies as the colonies that were emulating being English. The French considered every place that they were to be France. And so that's why
they kind of made it that way, didn't they?
That's right. And so that's why when we talk about Iberville and Bienville, who never, ever went to what we call France, but we never learned that in school. We just learned that there were the French settlers here and the French founders, but they never set foot in France.
Well, to continue about this restaurant chapter, of course, you discuss a lot of our greatest, our most well-known, our most significant ones. And Antoine, certainly one of the city's very first restaurants, made some incredible, significant contributions to our culinary traditions. And I think everybody in the universe knows about Oysters Rockefeller, but we also have Jules Alciatoir to thank for Pompano en Papio. And then it really blew my mind, Café Brule.
Mm-hmm. Café Brule was part, and this is another connection to Paris, because, of course, he went back to Paris for training. And it was at the time that flaming things were very, very big. And so, this was a trendy thing at the time. And he brought back this idea of doing this with a New Orleans product, which was coffee and chicory. And I think it's fabulous. It's dramatic. It really points out the idea of eating as drama, as eating as theater, eating as an art form.
Liz, you discuss all of these different cultures and the contributions that they made, and I know that you yourself are of a Sicilian heritage, so go ahead and boast a little bit about your people and tell us about their world and their contributions.
Well, like many, many immigrants, they came and got into the food business, not only because the Sicilians were already in the food business, but because it was the kind of thing that you could get involved in without speaking the language and without needing a major investment. So many of them worked in the French market. My great-grandfather was a butcher in the French market. And, of course, they were living in the French Quarter and in Tremé at a time when the French Quarter was really known as the Italian sector, because there were so many Italians there. And so they've definitely left their mark. They were growing different vegetables, things that we weren't already growing here. And there's the snowball.
I really didn't know that we had the Sicilians to thank for the snowball.
The Sicilians were bringing an Italian habit. It wasn't only Sicilian, but it was an Italian habit of getting snow and putting flavored syrups on the snow and eating it. And that's why snowballs are not crushed ice, because this was to emulate snow. And so you wanted to shave the ice to get something that was fluffier and finer than you could ever crush ice. And I think that that's a real connection that you can see and why it's not crushed.
And of course, our Creole sauce became transformed into red gravy.
That's right. That's right. I love the idea that this New World vegetable, the tomato, went back to Europe and then was in some places rejected, and people were afraid that it was poisonous and everything because of the nightshade. But in southern Italy and in Sicily, it was embraced. And then after canning and Napoleon and all of that sort of thing, they began to can those vegetables. And tomatoes are well suited for canning because they have a high acid content and all of that sort of thing. So people began to use canned tomatoes at a time that fresh tomatoes weren't available. And they brought that habit back to New Orleans, which it really wasn't here before.
There is another whole chapter on cookbooks and home cooks. And tell me your opinion about what is special or different here than in the rest of the U.S. when it comes to our philosophy of food at home.
We eat well at home. We have culture that requires, red beans and rice on Mondays and other sorts of things that we all recognize. And so I think one of the things that's important about eating at home in New Orleans is that you have a very high standard of what is going to be good, and it's going to be home cooking that is almost the standard. And our restaurants have very often tried to be as good as home. And I think a lot of times in other places, you don't expect that from home cooking. You don't expect excellence. It's an extraordinary thing when you have a really, really good home cook. And we eat the same things at home as people eat in restaurants, and we go through the trouble at home that people go through in restaurants. And so I think that that's something, obviously, in more modern times that may be being lost a little bit, and we use convenience foods and that sort of things in ways that our great-grandparents didn't do or whatever. So we do live in the modern world, but I do believe that our home cooking is like the best gumbo is my mama's gumbo or my grandmother's gumbo. It is the quintessential gumbo, not the gumbo at such and such a restaurant. That's not the quintessential gumbo.
I hardly ever eat gumbo out, to tell you the truth.
Right.
In the very beginning of the book, I love the timeline that you began in 1492 with Columbus, and then you take us right through 2010 and the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And I think it ties back to home cooks, and what we're losing is that in your timeline, you sandwiched the publication of Cooking Up a Storm between our two biggest disasters, Katrina and the oil spill. So why did you feel Cooking Up a Storm deserved its own recognition there?
So many people lost their cookbooks because of the flooding after Hurricane Katrina. So there were people who began to write to the Times-Picayune who said, what is the recipe for this? I had clipped it out of the paper and I kept it and I've lost it. And that was so important to people as a part of feeling whole again and feeling like the city was functioning again, because you're living here and you want all of that again because that was your old life and it was part of who you are and your identity. So I thought that it was remarkable that that was recognized by Judy Walker and Marcel Bienvenu and the Times-Picayune, so that they said, we're going to give these most requested recipes a place. That was, to me, a real recognition of something that the city needed. It was just one more thing, just as when the restaurants opened after Hurricane Katrina and people who had lost their homes opened their restaurants first, and it meant that you had a gathering place. All those people who were coming home, who had missed their food and were longing for their identity again and to eat with other people who knew what they were talking about. All of that was just really important to me in putting the city back right. And I thought that this cookbook was actually almost a memorialization of that.
Well, when we're thinking about New Orleans and our situation today, how it is to live here, and we've got such an influx of new people, our newcomers, God bless them, they're bringing such a breath of fresh air into the city. But do you think we're in danger of losing some of that home cook tradition?
Well, I think we are, not only because of the influx of new people, but just because everyone's lives are changing. There's the whole national movement of eating out more and all of that sort of thing. So we're not immune from all of that. We are part of the U.S. after all, even though sometimes I think we forget it. So yes, I think all of those things are affecting our home cooking. But I do believe that those of us who are here post-Katrina are also sensitive to what there is to lose. And so I don't believe it's going to go away. I think it will just change. And we've always had change. And it actually, to me, is a tribute to the vitality of the cuisine that it continues to change instead of just going away. Because you can ossify something and you can say, we won't let it change, and then it just dies.
That's correct.
And we are not letting it die. We're allowing it to evolve.
What do you see as most endangered from our food culture today?
Well, I think you've hit it on the head when you talk about home cooking. I do believe that that is the most endangered area. And that is why I welcome all the convenience foods, because I would rather see somebody open a can of red beans
Amen.
and,
eat them on Monday.
Eat them on Monday than not eat red beans at all and not eat at home. I think that eating at home with your family and that family meal and all of those things are really an important thing.
I think it's part of what makes the human culture human. And if we don't do it, we're in danger of, in fact, losing some of our humanity.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. So that's my hope. And so rather than decry these convenience foods, I just say great, because it is, and obviously people are buying them.
Yeah.
So there's enough interest in them, and people are saying, okay, I want to be able to eat at home. You're making it possible. And so I think that's a good thing.
Well, Liz, this has been such an interesting conversation, and I really want to offer you big congratulations on both your wonderful work with the museum and what I believe is a classic must-have book for every Louisiana food lover. Congratulations.
Thanks so much for having me.
Liz Williams, President of the National Food and Beverage Foundation and Director of the Southern Food and Beverage Museum. You can find her book, New Orleans, A Food Biography, in libraries and on bookstore shelves across the Crescent City. Learn how you can be involved in One Book, One New Orleans by visiting their Facebook page. We've got a link to the page in today's show notes. Music for this episode comes from National Tryst. Louisiana Eats original theme music by Johnny Sketch and the Dirty Notes. Thanks to Joe Schreiner, Reggie Morris, and Thomas Walsh for production help. I'm Poppy Tooker. Thanks for listening. And thanks to our major sponsors, Camellia Bean, Zatarain's, French Market Coffee, and Rouse's Markets. Visit poppytooker.com to see a full list of our partners. This Louisiana Eats Quick Bite was produced by Poppy Tooker Broadcasting.